In the choking heat of a Louisiana summer that felt like God's own judgment, a man of science stepped onto cursed ground. He carried only a lantern and the cold logic of a surgeon. But when Elias Thorne finally broke the seal on that windowless stone annex, 30 years after the last scream had been swallowed by its walls, he did not find treasure. He found the silent altar of a man who believed he could outwit divine wrath itself. 12 tiny beds. 12 ghosts that never got to grow up. And the first whispered question that still haunts every soul who hears this tale: did Silas Thorne lock those children away to save them, or to become their god? The year was 1880, but the air over Belle Reve Plantation carried the stench of 1853 all over again. That was the summer the yellow fever rose like the 10th plague of Egypt, turning the bayou parishes into open graves. Elias Thorne, 38 years old, hands still scarred from amputations performed by candlelight in New Orleans charity wards, stood at the edge of the long, weed-choked drive and felt the past reach up through the soles of his boots. The main house rose ahead of him like a dying aristocrat, once white columns now gray with mildew, verandas sagging as though the weight of every sin committed beneath them had finally become too much. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like funeral veils. The cotton fields that had once produced a king's ransom now lay choked by wild indigo and Johnson grass. Where 200 souls once toiled under the lash, only a handful of tenant cabins remained, their roofs patched with tin and prayer. Elias had come to sell it all. Sever the last thread tying him to a family name he barely recognized. The lawyer's letter had been blunt: sole heir, Silas Thorne, deceased 3 months prior, no other claimants. But the will contained one line that refused to be ignored, written in Silas's spidery, trembling hand. The annex is not to be touched by any hand but Elias's own. Its contents are his alone to judge. God have mercy on us both. Elias had laughed at the time, nervous, dismissive laughter of a man who had dissected cadavers and delivered babies in blood-soaked sheets. Mercy? From a God who let fever take children by the thousands? He did not believe in mercy anymore. Only in scalpels and sutures and the cold arithmetic of survival. Yet the moment he stepped onto the cracked flagstones of the front gallery, something shifted inside his chest. The cicadas screamed in unison, a sound like 10,000 tiny accusations. The air tasted of iron and wet earth and something sweeter, cloying, like dried blood left too long in the sun. He told himself it was exhaustion. The long train ride from New Orleans. The whiskey he had drunk to steady his nerves. But deep down, in the place where logic ends and the soul begins to tremble, Elias Thorne felt watched. He spent the first 3 days trying to exorcise the feeling with work. He hired 4 local men, freedmen's sons, mostly, to hack back the jungle that had swallowed the gardens. Their machetes rang against the overgrowth with a rhythm that sounded almost like chains. Elias cataloged what little remained in the main house: ledgers written in fading ink, a cracked family Bible with half its pages torn out, a single tintype of Silas as a younger man, eyes already hollow, mouth already set in the thin line of a man who had seen too much and understood too little. The locals would not speak his uncle's name above a whisper. Old Agnes, who had been house servant since before the war, would only say, Master Silas feared the world. Feared it so bad he tried to build one of his own. Then she would cross herself and turn away. The annex waited behind a curtain of cypress and moss, 100 yards from the big house, as though the plantation itself had tried to hide its shame. A squat stone box, no windows, one iron-banded oak door. The padlock that sealed it was not modern. It was a blacksmith's nightmare, hand-forged, thick as a man's wrist, rust eating it like cancer. Elias ran his gloved fingers across the cold metal and felt the same shiver he used to feel before operating on a patient he knew would not survive the night. He sent for Jebediah, the only blacksmith within 20 miles. The man arrived on a mule, tools clinking like guilty confessions. When he saw the lock, his face went the color of old ash. "You sure you want this opened, doctor?" Jebediah asked, voice low. "It's mine now," Elias answered. "Everything inside is mine to decide." Jebediah worked in silence. Each strike of hammer on chisel rang through the trees like a church bell tolling for the dead. Sweat poured down both men's faces. The air grew thicker, as though the very atmosphere resented the intrusion. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs in the same rhythm as the hammer. He told himself it was only the heat. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had once read scripture in medical school and dismissed it as superstition, began to whisper a different truth. This was not just a lock. This was a seal. And breaking it felt like tearing the veil between the living and the dead. When the padlock finally surrendered with a scream of tortured iron, Jebediah stepped back as though the door itself might lunge at him. "She's open, Mr. Thorne," he muttered. "But some doors, once you walk through 'em, you don't walk out the same man." He gathered his tools and vanished into the trees without looking back. Elias stood alone. The oak door resisted him like a living thing. He had to brace his shoulder against the wood, push with everything in him. Decades of neglect had warped the frame. When it finally gave way, the groan that came out of the darkness sounded almost human, a long, exhausted sigh of something that had been holding its breath since before the war. A wall of air rolled over him. Not merely stale, but consecrated in its foulness. Damp earth. Mildew. The faint, 6-week perfume of something that had once been alive and was now only memory. Elias gagged, pressed his sleeve to his face, and lit the lantern. The flame steadied. The beam sliced through the blackness like a surgeon's knife. The room was larger than he expected, 20 feet by 30, stone walls rising to a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow. The floor was packed. Earth, cool and damp beneath his boots. And arranged with the terrible precision of a man who believed he was doing holy work stood 12 small beds. Crude pine frames, no bigger than coffins for children. On some, threadbare blankets still lay folded with military exactness, as though their tiny occupants might return at any moment to sleep. Scattered between the beds lay the relics of stolen childhoods, a one-legged wooden horse, its paint flaked away like peeling skin, a rag doll with one button eye missing, the remaining eye staring up at the ceiling in eternal accusation, alphabet blocks worn smooth by small hands that had never learned to write their own names, a slate tablet with the faint ghost of the letter is scratched into it. In the center of the room sat a low table ringed by miniature stools. Tin cups and plates waited in perfect rows. A rusted hand pump stood against one wall, its handle frozen in mid-motion, as though the last drop of water drawn from it had been the last act of mercy these walls ever witnessed. High on one wall, a slit no wider than a man's finger let in a single blade of merciless sunlight. A window that was never a window. Only a reminder that outside, the world still turned while inside, time had been murdered. Elias's medical mind tried to catalog, to diagnose. No bodies. No smell of death. Only absence, 12 absences so complete they fell louder than any scream. He walked deeper. His boots left prints in the dust like footprints in fresh snow. On a shelf built into the stone he found 12 tin cups, each engraved with a single initial, M, L, J, S, R, 12 letters for 12 souls. He lifted one. The metal was ice cold despite the heat outside. And then he saw it. Beneath the last bed, half hidden by shadow, a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in brittle oilcloth, 12 hand-stitched leather pouches. Each contained a silver locket, tarnished black by time. Elias opened the first. A tintype stared back at him, a little girl, no more than 6, smiling the shy, uncertain smile of someone who had already learned that the world could be cruel. On the back, in faded ink, Marianne, age 5, 1852. He opened another. A boy with solemn eyes. Thomas, age 7. Another. Little Ruth. 12 lockets. 12 faces. 12 names that had once been whispered in prayers at bedtime in the slave quarters and tenant cabins. Elias's hands began to shake. These were not objects. These were people. Children who had laughed, cried, asked for stories, begged for their mothers. Children whose only crime had been being born on the wrong side of a man who believed fever was God's punishment and that he, Silas Thorne, could play savior. He turned to the wall near the door. Beneath decades of grime, he found them, tally marks. Hundreds upon hundreds, grouped in fives, marching down the stone like a sentence written by a mad scribe. He counted. Over 3,000. Roughly 9 years of captivity. 9 years. The war had come and gone. Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union had marched through these very fields. And all the while, 12 children had lived and breathed and prayed and slowly forgotten the sky inside this stone box, because one man had decided the outside world was too dangerous for them. Elias stepped back. His lantern trembled. The shadows danced across the drawings he now noticed on the far wall, crude but heartbreaking. Stick figure children holding hands around a tall, stern man. Above them, a small black rectangle with one tiny dot of light. The annex. The man's face was drawn with heavy lines. Silas. The children's god. Their jailer. Their father in a nightmare. One drawing showed a sun with rays like prison bars. Another showed birds flying away while the children reached up with broken wings. Elias felt something inside him crack open, something he had buried beneath years of scalpels and sutures and the comforting lie that science could explain everything. This was not madness. This was blasphemy. A man who had looked upon the suffering of innocence and decided he alone could rewrite God's plan. A man who had taken children from their mothers under the guise of protection and sealed them away like Noah sealing the ark while the flood of fever raged outside. Except the flood had ended. The waters had receded. And Silas had never opened the door. Elias's knees buckled. He caught himself against the table. The tin cups rattled like tiny bells tolling for the dead. Outside, the cicadas screamed louder, as though the earth itself were bearing witness. He stumbled back into the blinding Louisiana sunlight, the lockets heavy in his coat pocket like 12 accusations pressed against his heart. The main house loomed ahead, no longer merely dilapidated. It felt alive now, aware. Guilty. That night he could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes he saw those 12 faces staring up at him from the lockets. He heard the faint scratching of tally marks being carved by small, desperate hands. He smelled the cloying sweetness that lingered in the annex like the perfume of dried funeral flowers. And in the darkness, a new thought arrived, cold, biblical, undeniable. Silas Thorne had not merely committed a crime against man. He had committed a crime against heaven itself. And now the bill had come due. The annex had waited 30 years for the right man to open it. The man whose blood carried the same cursed name. The man who would have to decide what justice looked like when the guilty were already in the grave and the innocent had never been allowed to live. Elias Thorne pressed his face into his hands and did something he had not done since he was a boy, watching his own mother die of the very fever Silas had feared. He prayed. Not for forgiveness. For understanding. Because somewhere in the darkness between science and sin, between lockets and tally marks, between the God who sends plagues and the man who tries to cage them, lay the truth of what had really happened to those 12 children. And Elias was terrified that the answer would not be buried in the annex. It would be buried in him. He noticed a subtle discoloration on the packed earth floor in one corner, a darker patch that seemed to have been. He knelt in the far corner where the earth floor had darkened, not from water, not from mold, but from something heavier. Something that had settled there like guilt pressed into soil. With the small surgeon's trowel he always carried, habit from years of probing wounds no one else dared touch, Elias scraped away the top layer. The dirt gave way too easily, as though it had been waiting to be uncovered. Beneath lay a plain wooden box, no bigger than a family Bible. No lock. No carving. Just humility that felt like mockery. Elias lifted the lid. Inside, cradled on a thin bed of brittle bay leaves that still carried the faintest ghost of green, rested 12 wooden birds. Each one was different. A mockingbird with wings half spread, frozen in mid-song. A cardinal, beak open as though calling to a sky it had never seen. A tiny owl, eyes wide and knowing. A sparrow whose tail feathers had been whittled so delicately they looked ready to flutter if only someone breathed on them. The craftsmanship was heartbreaking. Small hands had made these, or perhaps larger ones trying to mimic innocence. Every wingtip, every carved eye socket, carried the tremor of someone who believed flight was still possible. Elias lifted the mockingbird. Its weight was nothing. Its meaning was everything. He turned to the heavy oak door. In the lantern light the scratches appeared like faint silver veins running vertically along the inner face. Not the wild gouges of panic. Not the claw marks of animals trapped too long. These were rhythmic. Patient. Almost meditative. Tiny crescent moons repeated hundreds of times, shoulder height for an adolescent. Several someones had stood here year after year, fingertips tracing the same path. Not trying to escape anymore. Simply remembering what motion felt like. Elias pressed his palm against the wood. The scratches felt warm under his skin, as though the door still held the heat of small bodies that had leaned against it in the dark. He left the annex without closing the door behind him. For the first time since arriving at Belle Rive, he could not bear to seal it again. That evening the main house felt smaller, the walls closer. Elias carried the wooden birds and one locket back to the parlor and laid them on the scarred oak table where Silas once took his solitary meals. 12 birds. 12 faces in tarnished silver. 12 accusations arranged in perfect rows. He found Agnes at dawn the next morning, kneeling among the wilted okra in her patch. She did not rise when he approached. She only waited. Elias knelt beside her and opened his hand. Little Clara's locket rested in his palm. Agnes made a sound, half sob, half prayer. Her crooked fingers closed around the silver oval. She traced the child's face through the glass as though she could stroke real skin. Clara used to sing hymns to the chickens, Agnes whispered. Said they liked Amazing Grace best. Used to make me laugh till my sides hurt. How long, Agnes? Elias asked, voice low. How long were they in there before the sound stopped? Agnes stared at the locket so long he thought she might never answer. Long enough for babies to become children, she finally said. Long enough for children to become something else. Master Silas went in every morning at first. Bread. Water from the pump. A bucket of lessons reading from the Bible, sums on the slate, names of plants that could heal or poison. He called it school. Said he was raising apostles for when the world ended. She looked up at Elias then, eyes ancient and wet. But the war came. Soldiers. Raids. Food grew scarce. He started skipping days. Then weeks. Then he just stood at the door sometimes. Listening. Like he was waiting for them to tell him they were ready. One morning he came back pale as death. Said, they don't need me anymore. They've ascended. Then he put that lock on. Never went near it again. Elias felt the ground tilt beneath him. Ascended, he repeated. The word tasted like ash. Agnes nodded once. That's what he told himself. That their bodies weren't necessary anymore. That purity had set them free. Elias stood. The sun was already merciless. He felt it burning through his shirt like judgment. He found Tom Finch in the east field, bent over rows of half-dead corn. The overseer straightened slowly, joints popping like dry twigs. His eyes, once sharp, were clouded now, not with age, but with something older than years. Tom, Elias said. No greeting. No preamble. Tom wiped sweat from his brow with a rag that had once been white. Figured you'd come. Agnes told me Silas stopped going in. Said the children ascended. You were his right hand for 20 years. You knew. Tom looked past Elias toward the line of cypress that hid the annex. I knew enough to be damned, Doctor. Not enough to be saved. Did you ever try to stop him? Tom laughed, a short, broken sound. Tried once. Year the war started. Told him the children were wasting away. Skin like paper. Eyes too big. He looked at me calm as Sunday and said, they're being refined, Tom. Like gold in the fire. Earthly food only weighs down the spirit. I begged. Told him mothers still cried at night for their babies. He just quoted scripture. Suffer the little children to come unto me. Then he told me if I spoke of it again, he'd put me in the field with the rest of the hands. Me. After 20 years. Tom's voice cracked on the last word. I went back once, he continued. Before the big lock. He let me inside. Just for a minute. They sat in a circle around him like disciples. Pale. Thin. But quiet. Too quiet. They looked at me with eyes that already knew the end of the story. One little girl, Clara, reached out and touched my hand. Her fingers were cold. She whispered, "Tell Mama we're learning to fly." Then Silas closed the door. Elias felt bile rise in his throat. Tom looked down at the dirt. After that, I told myself they were gone. That whatever was left in there wasn't them anymore. Easier that way. Kept the place running. Kept my own family fed. Kept pretending I wasn't a coward. Silence stretched between them, thick as the bayou mud. "You think they starved?" Elias asked finally. Tom shook his head. "I think they waited. Long as they could. Then they just stopped waiting." Elias walked away without another word. Behind him, Tom Finch returned to his hoeing as though nothing had changed. But everything had. That night Elias unlocked Silas's study. The room smelled of old paper, mildew, and something coppery that made the back of his tongue ache. He found the journals behind a false panel in the fireplace, dozens of them, leather cracked like dry skin. He started with 1850. The handwriting was neat at first. Precise. The entries described the fever rolling through the parishes like Pharaoh's plague. Bodies wrapped in sheets left on gallery steps. Church bells tolling without pause. Silas wrote of visions, angels with blackened wings sweeping over the fields, collecting souls too impure to keep. He believed God had chosen him to preserve a remnant. Children. Only children. They alone remain unstained, he wrote. The adults are already lost. But these 12, I will make them the seed of the world that comes after. He detailed the recruitment. No violence. No abduction. Just persuasion wrapped in desperation. Parents who had buried one child already, staring at the remaining ones like they were next. Silas offered sanctuary. Education. Safety. A few coins pressed into trembling hands. Promises that the children would be returned when the cleansing was complete. A ledger tucked inside the journals listed names, ages, parents, dates received. 6 boys. 6 girls. Ages 5 to 10. Some from the quarters. Some from neighboring farms. Mixed blood, mixed skin tones. Silas dismissed worldly divisions as irrelevant. Purity, he wrote, resided in the soul, not the flesh. The annex entries were meticulous. Floor plans. Ventilation slits calculated for air without escape. Daily schedule, dawn prayers, scripture reading, arithmetic, botany, astronomy. He taught them constellations through descriptions alone. He recorded their progress like a proud father. Marianne recited Psalm 23 without error. Thomas identified 6 medicinal herbs correctly. Little Ruth asked if heaven has windows. I told her no, heaven needs no windows, only light. Then the war began. Entries grew jagged. Ink blots. Crossed out lines. He wrote of Union gunboats on the river, of cotton fields burning, of soldiers who carried the stench of corruption. He became convinced the annex was the last pure place on earth. They are safe, he wrote in 1861. The fire cannot touch them here. By early 1862 the tone shifted entirely. They no longer require bread, he wrote. Their spirits draw sustenance from purity itself. I have seen it in their eyes. They are becoming what I always knew they could be. The final purification has begun. The next page was blank except for 3 words in the center, underlined twice. Release is coming. After that, no more mention of the children. Only prophecies. Visions of rivers running red. Stars falling like judgment. The end of days. Elias closed the last journal. His hands were numb. He understood now. Silas had not simply abandoned them. He had performed what he believed was the final mercy. In his mind, starvation was not death, it was transcendence. He had locked the door believing he was setting them free. Elias stood. The metallic scent in the room was stronger now. Not blood. Not iron. It was the smell of delusion left to rot. He walked to the window and looked toward the annex. Moonlight silvered the cypress branches. Somewhere in that stone box, 12 wooden birds waited beside 12 empty beds. 12 lockets held 12 faces that had once smiled at mothers they no longer remembered. And somewhere deeper still, perhaps in the marrow of the man who shared Silas's blood, Elias felt the first cold certainty take hold. The children were gone. But the sin was not. It had been waiting 30 years for someone to inherit it. And now it had. He turned from the window. The tally marks. The birds. The scratches on the door. They were not evidence of a crime that had ended. They were evidence of a crime that had never stopped. Not until tonight. Not until a man of science finally understood that some sins cannot be dissected. They can only be carried. But no lanterns burn now. Only memory. And memory, Elias was learning, could be crueler than any flame. The children had not been stolen in the night. They had been given away in daylight, handed over with trembling hands and tear-streaked prayers. Parents who had already buried siblings to the fever looked at Silas Thorne and saw not a kidnapper but a shield. A man with land, with books, with a quiet voice that spoke of safety when everything else screamed danger. A special school, he told them. A place apart from sickness. They'll learn. They'll thrive. When the world heals, I'll bring them home. One by one they came. A mother pressing a locket into her daughter's palm. A father whispering last words into a son's ear. The children, 5 to 10 years old, stepped through the oak door carrying nothing but hope and whatever small treasures fit in their pockets. Perhaps a smooth river stone. Perhaps a ribbon from a sister's hair. Perhaps nothing at all. Silas closed the door behind them. Not with violence. With ceremony. As though sealing an ark. In those first months the routine must have felt almost bearable. Dawn prayers recited in unison. Chalk scratching across slate as they learned their letters under his stern gaze. Stories of stars they could only imagine, described in meticulous detail through the narrow slit of light high above. He fed them cornmeal mush, beans soaked overnight, the occasional strip of salt pork when the smokehouse still had stores. Water pumped fresh each morning, cool and metallic. He rewarded obedience with an extra spoonful or a rare smile. Punishment was isolation, hours spent facing the wall, hands folded, thinking on sin. The journals called it discipline. Elias called it control. He pictured them growing accustomed to the rhythm. The older ones helping the younger tie shoelaces that no longer needed tying. Games played in whispers, shadow puppets on the wall, stories invented. To fill the silence. Laughter, at first, though muffled. The carved birds must have come later, perhaps during a lesson on creation, Silas demonstrating how to whittle life from wood. Or perhaps the children made them in secret, hiding the small figures under their beds like talismans against the dark. But the war arrived like a second fever. Supplies thinned. The river boats stopped. Fields lay fallow. Silas's visits grew shorter. A week between meals became 2. Then 3. He stood outside the door sometimes, ear pressed to oak, listening for proof that his experiment continued without him. In his mind the children no longer needed bread. Purity sustained them. The spirit fed on righteousness alone. Elias could see it now, clear as a medical chart, the slow atrophy. Cheeks hollowing. Eyes growing larger in shrinking faces. Skin paling to the color of river silt. The pump handle grew harder to move as strength failed. Water tasted of rust and regret. Disease crept in, dysentery first, then something respiratory that rattled in small chests like dry leaves. No medicine. No sunlight to kill the shadows inside their bodies. The tally marks told the rest. Neat groups of 5 at the beginning. Then erratic scratches, as though the hand holding the nail trembled. Then gaps. Days unmarked because no one had strength left to stand. The last marks were faint, barely breaking the grime, perhaps made by a single child, the final one, scraping with a fingernail because the nail had long since been lost. Elias knelt beside the darker patch of earth in the corner. He did not dig again. He did not need to. 30 years in Louisiana dampness had done the work nature always does. Bodies small enough to begin with had folded back into the soil that cradled them. Bones to dust. Dust to nothing. Only the faintest sweet rot lingered in the air on humid days, a perfume of absence. The wooden birds buried in their box were not Silas's doing. Elias knew that now. They were the children's last sacrament. Perhaps the oldest girl, Clara, who sang to chickens, had gathered them one by one as companions died. Wrapped them in bay leaves like a mother wrapping infants. Placed them in the earth with whispered goodbyes. A funeral no one else would attend. He left the annex and walked the overgrown path to the main house. The cicadas had gone quiet for once, as though the night itself held its breath. Dr. Alistair Reed lived in a white-clapboard cottage on the edge of town, porch screened against mosquitoes, rocking chair still moving slightly when Elias arrived. The old physician's hands shook as he poured tea, but his eyes remained sharp, scalpel sharp. He read the journal excerpts Elias offered without flinching. When he finished, he set the pages down as though they burned. Messianic delusion, Reed said. Grandiose, paranoid, eschatological. He saw himself as Noah, but without the floodwaters ever receding. The children were his remnant. Pure stock for Eden rebuilt. Did you ever suspect? Elias asked. Reed exhaled through his nose. Suspect is a strong word. I knew he was strange. Came to me for his own ailments, insomnia, headaches, what he called visions. Always secretive about the annex. Called it his conservatory for rare botanicals. Said certain plants could live without light if their essence was strong enough. I laughed. Thought it harmless eccentricity. He paused. Looked out at the darkening street. Now I see he applied the same logic to human souls. If a plant could be purified through deprivation, why not a child? Starvation as sacrament. Decay as deliverance. Elias felt the words settle like lead in his chest. He believed their deaths were ascension, Elias said. Reed nodded once. In his mind he was merciful. The war confirmed it, the world ending exactly as he prophesied. Why feed bodies already shedding their mortal coil? He wasn't abandoning them, Mr. Thorne. In his pathology, he was releasing them. Elias returned to Belle Reve under a sky-bruised purple. The plantation felt smaller now, as though guilt had shrunk the horizon. He sat in Silas's study until dawn, journals open around him like accusations. One entry from 1863 stood out, written in ink that had bled. They have passed the final trial. No longer bound by flesh. I heard their voices last night, not crying, but singing. A hymn of pure light. The ark has fulfilled its purpose. Release is complete. Elias closed the book. His own hands felt foreign the surgeon's hands that had saved lives, now holding proof that bloodkin had ended them. Outside, the annex waited. Door ajar. Lantern gone out. He did not go back inside that night. Instead, he stood on the gallery and listened to the bayou. Frogs. Wind in the moss. Somewhere far off, an owl called, low, mournful, unanswered. The children had wanted to fly. They had carved birds to prove it. Silas had promised them wings. All he gave them was stone. And 30 years later, the sin still sat heavy on the air, unburied, unburned, waiting for the last thorn to decide what justice looked like when the guilty were dust and the innocent were only echoes. Elias touched the locket at his throat, Clara's, taken from the box. The metal was warm from his skin. He whispered her name into the dark. Not as apology. As witness. Because some sins end in silence. But memory refuses to die quiet. He had not opened the box again since the moment he pried the hidden compartment from the stone. He did not need to. The image was carved into him now, deeper than any surgical scar he had ever inflicted or stitched. A child's heart. No larger than his fist. Chosen, Silas had written in that frantic final scrawl, because she was the purest. The vessel. The seed. Lily. Agnes had named her without prompting. The smallest. The quietest. The one who never cried for her mother after the first month, as though she had already accepted that the world beyond the door no longer existed. Silas had watched her most closely, the journals revealed. Not with affection, with measurement. He recorded her stillness as virtue, her silence as sanctity. In his mind she had already begun to transcend before the others even weakened. Elias carried the box to the old oak near the ruined garden, the one Tom Finch had pointed out with a trembling finger. Silas had spent days digging there after the war, muttering about sacred ground, about planting something that would outlast empires. Tom had thought it madness. Agnes had thought it grief. Neither had dared look too closely. Elias knelt. The earth was soft, forgiving. He dug with bare hands until his fingers bled, until the hole was deep enough to swallow shame. He placed the box inside. No prayer. No words. Only the sound of dirt falling like judgment, one handful at a time. When the ground was level again, he pressed his palm to the soil and felt it cool against his skin, as though the earth were saying, "Let this end here." He rose and looked back at the annex. Its stone walls caught the dying light and seemed almost to breathe. He could not sell this place. Not now. Not ever. The next morning he summoned the same crew that had cleared the overgrowth weeks before. Tom Finch arrived first, eyes hollow but steady. Agnes followed, leaning on a stick carved from cypress, her face set in lines of quiet resolve. No one asked questions. They understood the work was penance. They began inside. The crude beds were dismantled plank by plank, carried out in silence. The toys, the one-legged horse, the button-eyed doll, were wrapped in clean cloth and placed in a cedar chest Elias had brought from the main house. The slate tablets, still bearing faint traces of childish letters, were stacked like gravestones. Every tally mark on the wall was photographed by lantern light using Elias's medical camera, every scratch on the door traced with charcoal and paper. Nothing was destroyed. Everything was remembered. The lead-lined box went beneath the foundation stone they lifted together. Elias poured quicklime over it first, not to hasten decay, but to ensure no root would ever find it. No tree of life would grow from this ground. Not Silas's tree. When the interior was bare, they widened the ventilation slit into a proper window, framing it with salvaged cypress. Sunlight poured in for the first time in 30 years, touching stone that had known only shadow. The heavy oak door was replaced with one of pine, painted white, hinged to swing easily. The packed earth floor was leveled and covered with clean boards. Whitewash brightened the walls until the mold stains vanished like forgiven sins. Elias furnished it simply, small desks planed from fallen timber, benches smoothed by hand, a blackboard salvaged from the old parish school. Books arrived by barge, primers, Bibles, volumes of poetry and natural history. A small stove for winter heat. A bell to call the children to lessons. He established a trust with what remained of Silas's meager accounts and his own savings from New Orleans. Enough to pay a teacher, to buy slates and chalk, to keep the roof sound. Agnes became caretaker, sweeping, tending flowers she planted along the path, humming hymns she once sang to keep small spirits calm. Tom Finch took charge of the grounds, repairing fences, planting rows of okra and beans so the school could feed itself. The annex was reborn as a schoolhouse. Not grand. Not famous. Just a quiet place where tenant children, black, white, mixed, could learn their letters, trace maps of a world larger than the bayou, and laugh without fear of locked doors. Elias stayed. He practiced medicine quietly, setting broken bones, delivering babies, stitching wounds from cotton hooks and saws. He never spoke of the annexes passed to the new families. He never told the children who now ran their fingers along the whitewashed walls that those same stones had once held tally marks of despair. Some truths, he decided, were too heavy for young shoulders. They needed light first. Questions could come later. Years folded over the plantation like moss on oak. The schoolhouse bell rang each morning, clear and hopeful. Laughter drifted across the fields where cotton once grew under whips. The cypress stood sentinel, Spanish moss swaying like gentle forgiveness. Agnes died peacefully in her sleep one spring night, a Bible open on her lap to Psalm 23. Tom followed 2 winters later, found in his rocking chair with a half-whittled bird in his hands. Elias buried them both beneath the live oaks, simple stones bearing only names and dates. No epitaphs. They had written their own in the lives they helped mend. Elias grew old on Belle Rive. Hair silvered. Hands slower with the scalpel. But every evening he walked the path to the schoolhouse, sat on the steps, and listened. The building no longer smelled of damp earth and decay. It smelled of chalk dust, wood smoke, and children. Whispers persisted in the parishes, of course. Old ones spoke of vanished children, of a mad planter who locked away innocence. Younger ones laughed, ghost stories for campfires. Elias let the tales drift. Let them blur. Some horrors were better carried as legend than dissected as fact. Exposure would bring scandal, reporters, grave-digging curiosity. It would wound the living to avenge the dead who no longer needed vengeance. Instead, he guarded the truth quietly. He walked to the old oak sometimes, pressed his palm to the bark, felt the slow pulse beneath. No unnatural growth ever appeared. No twisted branches. Just a tree, tall and ordinary, drinking rain and giving shade. One twilight in his 73rd year Elias sat beneath that oak as the sun bled gold across the bayou. He held Clara's locket in his palm, the one he had never returned to the chest. The tintype inside had faded further, but the shy smile remained. He spoke to the air. "I couldn't save you," he said. "But I gave your room back its light." A breeze moved through the leaves. It sounded almost like children laughing, distant, fleeting, free. Elias closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket. He rose slowly, joints protesting, and walked back toward the main house. Behind him the schoolhouse bell rang once, soft, unhurried, calling tomorrow's lesson. Belle Rive was no longer haunted. It was remembered. And in that quiet remembering, 12 small souls had finally been allowed to fly. Not on wooden wings carved in darkness, but on sunlight let in by a man who chose atonement over erasure. The annex stood silent no more. It sang with life. And somewhere, in the place where guilt and grace finally meet, Elias Thorne found the only piece a witness to such darkness could ever hope to claim.